The night shift doesn't care that your husband is 4 months in the ground. It starts at 11 and it ends at 7. And in between, you move trays, wipe counters, and smile at people who are too sick to notice whether your smile is real. Mine hasn't been real in 4 months. My name is Wileen Freeman, and I want to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. The thing that almost killed me wasn't the grief. It was everything I didn't know while I was busy grieving. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Odell went on a Tuesday, no warning. He was standing in the kitchen, pouring his second cup of coffee, and then he wasn't standing anymore. By the time the paramedics got there, the coffee was still warm. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the hospital, not the call to Shira, the coffee. Still warm on the counter, like it was waiting for him to come back and finish it. I took the dietary aid position at Piedmont Medical 3 weeks after we buried him. It was the job that was hiring. It paid enough to cover the monthly installment on the house. The payment Odell had been making for 4 years toward a property that was almost ours. I kept making it because I didn't know what else to do with the paperwork sitting in his desk drawer. I told myself I'd deal with it when I had the strength. 4 months later, I still didn't have the strength, so I just kept paying. That's what survival looks like from the inside. Not brave, just keep moving, keep paying. Don't stop long enough to feel how quiet the house has gotten. If you're watching this and you know exactly what I mean, drop a timestamp in the comments and tell me what time you're watching. I want to know I'm not talking to empty air tonight. The dietary aid shift ends at 3 in the morning. Charlotte in November at 3 in the morning is a particular kind of cold. The kind that gets into your shoulders before you reach the door. I had been calling cabs because the bus didn't run that late, and I couldn't afford to think too hard about that on top of everything else. The first night I got Jim Halbert, I almost didn't get in. He pulled up in a clean gray sedan and rolled the window down and said, "Freeman?" Just like that. Last name. Like a man who'd spent years calling people by their last names and never thought to stop. I got in. He didn't make conversation. Neither did I. We rode 30 minutes through quiet streets, and when he pulled up to the house on Grandin, he waited, engine running, not pulling off, until I got my key in the door and the light came on inside. I looked back once. He was still there. I told myself it was nothing. Just a careful man. But before I went in, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I had 2 cups of coffee in my hand. I'd poured them both in the break room out of habit, the way I used to pour one for myself and one for Odell every single morning for 11 years. I stood there at the door, holding a cup I had no one to give to. I set it on the porch rail. I don't know why. I went inside. The house was quiet the way only a house with a missing person in it can be quiet. Not empty, just wrong. Like a sentence with the last word cut off. I didn't sleep. I just lay there and listened to it. By the 3rd week, I stopped pretending I was going to call a different driver. It wasn't a decision I made out loud. It just happened the way things happen when you're too tired to fight your own patterns. Jim Halbert showed up at 11:05 every night. Clean gray sedan, engine quiet, and I got in. No small talk required, no performance. Just 30 minutes of someone else doing the driving. While I sat in the back and let my shoulders drop for the first time all shift. That was worth more than I knew how to say. The coffee started the 2nd week. I'd brought 2 cups out of habit again. Same as that first night. And this time, instead of leaving one on the porch rail like a woman losing her mind, I tapped on his window before I got in the back. He looked at me the way men look when they're trying to figure out if something is a trick. I held up the cup. He took it. That was the whole conversation. After that, it was just what we did. I saved him a cup every shift. He took it without making a production of it. Some nights we talked. Some nights we didn't. But the cup was always there, and he always took it. And somewhere in that small, stupid routine, I found the only 20 minutes of the day that felt like something other than maintenance. Jim Halbert was not a man who filled silence with noise. That alone made him different from most people I'd encountered since Adele died. People who talked at you because your grief made them uncomfortable, who needed you to perform recovery so they could feel better about walking away. Jim didn't need anything from me. He just drove, but he watched. I noticed that early. Not in a way that felt wrong, in a way that felt practiced. Like observation was something he'd done so long it had become structural. The way some people breathe from their chest, and some people breathe from their stomach, and they couldn't explain the difference if you asked them. He noticed things. A car parked at an angle that didn't match the others. A light on in a house at an hour when lights shouldn't be on. He never commented. He just noted. I could see it in the slight pause before he pulled off. A beat where his eyes moved in a pattern I didn't have a name for yet. One night he told me about Jordan. Casually, the way you mention weather, his daughter. Nursing school up in Durham. She called him every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesdays when a shift went hard. He said it with the specific quietness of a man who had missed more than he meant to and was trying to make peace with that. I didn't push. He didn't elaborate. But the information settled something in me I hadn't realized was unsettled. He was a father. He had somebody. He was not a man with nothing to lose driving strangers through Charlotte at 3 in the morning for reasons I needed to worry about. He was just a man trying to stay useful in the hours he couldn't sleep. 3 weeks in, somewhere on the stretch of Grandin before my turn, he asked how long I'd been in the neighborhood. I told him Odell had been buying the house, that we were supposed to finish the paperwork together, that he went before we got there. I didn't explain what that meant. I wasn't sure I fully understood what it meant myself. Jim didn't say anything right away. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, and made the turn. But in the rearview mirror, just for a second, something moved across his face. Not sympathy. Something quieter than that. Something that looked almost like recognition. I didn't know what to do with that, so I let it go. Odell Freeman was not a complicated man. He paid his bills on time, kept his word, and believed that owning something outright was the only kind of owning that meant anything. That belief is what started the whole thing. 4 years before he died, he found the house on Grandin Road through a man named Dale Cossett, a developer who had been quietly buying up properties on Charlotte's west side and selling them through installment land contracts to buyers who couldn't qualify for traditional financing. The arrangement was straightforward on the surface. Odell made monthly payments directly to Cossett. When the final payment cleared, the deed transferred into Odell's name. 4 years of payments, 3 weeks from the finish line. Then a Tuesday morning came and took everything with it. What I didn't understand, what nobody sat me down and explained in plain language, was that an installment land contract is not a mortgage. There is no bank holding the deed in trust. The deed stays in the seller's name until that last payment clears, which meant that when Odell died, the house was still, on paper, Dale Cossett's property. 4 years of payments, and the deed had never moved. I didn't know that. I just kept paying because the payment book was in the drawer, and the due date came every month, and stopping felt like giving up on something Odell had spent 4 years building. Odell and I were never legally married. 11 years together. We talked about it, planned it, always found a reason to wait. His mother's health, Shira's college, the right time that never quite arrived. I didn't think it mattered. We were as married as two people could be without the paperwork. But in the state of North Carolina, that paperwork is everything. Because we weren't married, I had no automatic legal standing to his estate. His legal next of kin was Shira, his daughter from his first marriage, 26 years old, living 20 minutes away in Noda. Shira and I had always been cordial, not close, but respectful. She grieved her father in her own way, and I grieved him in mine, and we didn't get in each other's way about it. She didn't know about the installment contract. I had mentioned the house payments once, briefly, in the first week after the funeral, and she'd nodded the way people nod when they're holding too much to take on anything new. Neither of us had called an attorney. Neither of us had opened his estate. We had both been surviving and telling ourselves there was time. There wasn't time. We just didn't know it yet. What I knew was that Dale Cossett had called twice in the past month asking about documentation. Estate paperwork, he said. Just routine, he said. He needed to confirm the status of the contract given the change in circumstances. His voice was pleasant both times. The particular pleasantness of a man who has done something before and knows exactly how to frame it. I found the calls irritating, the way you find a slow drain irritating. Something that needed attention, but not urgently, not today, not when I had a shift in 4 hours and my feet already hurt from the last one. I didn't call him back. I told myself I'd deal with it when I had the energy. I was living in a house that a man named Dale Cossett could legally argue was still his. I was making payments on a contract I'd never read. I had no attorney, No open estate and no idea that the calls I was ignoring were not about paperwork at all. They were about whether anyone was watching. Nobody was. Not yet. I mentioned the calls the way you mention something you've already decided isn't important. Sideways. Between sips, filling silence on the ride home. Dale Cossett had called again. Documentation. Estate status. The usual pleasantness that was starting to feel less pleasant the more I heard it. Jim didn't respond right away. He let the information sit in the car with us for a moment before he asked his question. You ever looked him up? I turned my head. Looked who up? Cossett. I hadn't. It hadn't occurred to me that looking up the man Odell had been paying for 4 years was something I needed to do. He was a seller, a businessman, a name on a payment book. Why would I look him up, I said. Not a question. More like a woman trying to understand why the floor had just shifted slightly under her feet. Jim was quiet for another moment. Then he said, I worked Guilford County for 19 years. Property crime, mostly. Last years before I left, I've worked 3 cases that started with the same combination you're describing. An installment contract, a recent death or hardship, and a seller suddenly asking questions about paperwork and estate status. I waited. Installment contract sellers, he said. West Side neighborhoods, transitional areas, places where the demographics were changing, and the properties were starting to be worth more than the original buyers paid. Sellers would find buyers who couldn't get traditional financing, structure these contracts, collect payments for years. Then something would happen. A death, a financial hardship, a missed payment, and they'd trigger the forfeiture clause. Keep every payment made. Take the property back. Resell it at the new market rate. The car was very quiet. 3 cases, I said. 3 that I personally worked. 2 went nowhere civilly. 1 man went to prison, but it took 4 years and the family still lost the house. He paused. The sellers always used someone local to watch the property, to know when a situation was manageable. I sat with that word, manageable. The way he said it told me everything about what it meant. You said you recognized his name, I said, peripherally. A civil dispute in Guilford County maybe 6 years ago. His name came up in documentation on a property transfer that looked irregular. Nothing was ever filed. He glanced in the rear view. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means nobody pushed hard enough. I didn't say anything for the rest of the ride. Not because I had nothing to say, but because something was rearranging itself in my chest. And I needed to be still while it happened. Jim pulled up to the house on Grandin. I got out. I said goodnight. He nodded. Inside, I stood in Odell's kitchen for a long time. 4 years of payments. 3 weeks from the end. And a man who had structured the whole arrangement calling me about documentation with that pleasant, patient voice. I thought about the word manageable, and I didn't sleep at all. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that after he dropped me off that night, Jim Halbert didn't pull away. He pulled to the end of the block, and he stopped. He sat there with the engine idling, and his eyes on the rearview mirror. 3 minutes and 40 seconds after my light came on inside, the window in the house directly across the street lit up. Ground floor, the angle gave a direct sightline to my front door. Jim reached into his glove box. He took out a small notebook. The kind with the wire spiral at the top, the kind a man carries when he has spent 19 years writing things down. He wrote the time, he wrote the address, he wrote window, 3 min 40 sec post arrival. First logged observation. He always had a notebook, old habits from old work. He was going to need it. I noticed it the way you notice a stone in your shoe. Not immediately, not as something urgent, just as something slightly wrong that your body registers before your mind catches up. It was parked 2 houses down from mine. Dark blue, older model sedan, not the kind of car anyone on Grandin Road drove. The neighborhood had been changing fast enough that I knew most of the vehicles by sight. The contractors' trucks, the young couple's SUVs, the few remaining old-timers' practical sedans. This one didn't fit any category. It was just there, engine off, nobody getting in or out. I noticed it on a Tuesday. I noticed it again on same spot, same car, same stillness. I didn't think threat. I thought, someone visiting someone with car trouble, someone too tired to drive home after a long shift, parked and sleeping it off. I thought every ordinary explanation first, because that is what women like me do. We give the world the benefit of the doubt until the world makes that impossible. Because the alternative is living afraid every minute of every day, and I had already used up my fear reserves on grief. I mentioned it to Jim the way I mentioned everything those days. Sideways, between the coffee and the quiet, filling the ride home with small observations that cost nothing. There's been a car sitting on my block, I said. Same spot 2 nights running. Blue sedan. Older. Jim's hands didn't move on the wheel. His eyes didn't cut to the mirror. Everything about him stayed exactly the same. That stillness was the tell. A man who hadn't heard anything significant would have said something casual. Maybe it's a neighbor's visitor. Maybe somebody's working late. Jim said nothing for 4 full seconds. I counted without meaning to. Then he said, "What kind of blue?" Not "is everything okay?" Not "that's probably nothing." "What kind of blue?" "Dark," I said, "almost black in bad light. 2-door or 4, older. Maybe 10 years. You see any part of the plate?" I looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road with the specific focus of a man who was doing 2 things at once, driving and cataloging. "The first 3 letters," I said slowly. "I think it started with RT. He nodded once. That was all. We rode the rest of the way without talking, and when he pulled up to the house on Grandin, I got out and stood for a moment at the window. "Jim," he looked at me. "That car means something to you." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He said, "Get inside and lock your door." "Sleep well." I went inside. I locked the door. I did not sleep well. What I didn't know was that after he dropped me off, after he watched my light come on and Arvel's window activate at its usual interval, Jim opened his glove box and took out his notebook. He already had 2 entries for a dark blue 4-door sedan on Grandin Road. The first sighting 11 days ago, the second 6 days ago. Both times logged after drop-off, both times the car was present during the window activation window, parked, engine off, positioned with a sightline to my front door. He wrote the date. He wrote the partial plate she'd given him. He wrote, 3rd sighting. Victim provided description. Consistent with prior logged vehicle. Pattern confirmed. 3 incidents, same car. Correlates with window surveillance, not random. He underlined the last 2 words, not random. He sat there a long time before he pulled away. He called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was still in my uniform, still smelling like the hospital, still standing in the kitchen, trying to decide if I had the energy to cook or if crackers and coffee would have to be enough. The name on the screen made my stomach do something small and unpleasant. I answered because not answering felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. Ems. Freeman. His voice was same as always, warm, unhurried, the voice of a man with nothing pressing on his conscience. "I'm so sorry to bother you again. I just need a couple of things to keep everything in order on my end. Nothing complicated." I leaned against the counter and waited. "The contract requires documentation when there's a change in the buyer's circumstances," he said. "Just a death certificate, which I'm sure you have, and proof that Mr. Freeman's estate has been opened. Standard stuff. Once I have those, we can keep processing your payments without any issues." I told him I'd been dealing with a lot. I told him I needed more time to gather the documents. He said, of course, take all the time I needed. He completely understood. He just wanted to make sure everything stayed clean on the paperwork side. He hung up still pleasant, still warm. I stood there for a long time after. Something about the call had changed shape from the previous ones. He had been vague before, documentation, estate status, things that felt bureaucratic and distant. This time he had named specific things. A death certificate, proof of estate administration. He wanted to know whether probate had been opened. My instinct said that was specific in a way that mattered. My exhaustion said I was reading too much into a routine business call. I went back and forth between those 2 positions for the entire walk to Jim's car that night. I told him about the call before we'd cleared the hospital parking lot. Jim listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet, I had learned, meant he was not thinking about what to say next, but about how much to say. "What exactly did he ask for?" Jim said. "Death certificate and proof the estate's been opened." He nodded slowly. "He's not asking for paperwork." I looked at him. An installment contract seller asking whether probate has been opened is asking one thing, Jim said. "Whether you have an attorney. Whether anyone with legal standing is paying attention to that contract." He paused. "If you told him no estate has been opened, he'd know you're unrepresented. He'd know the clock is his." The crackers and coffee exhaustion I'd walked out of the house with was completely gone now. He's asking whether anyone is watching, I said. That's all he's asking. I sat with that for a moment, the pleasant voice, the warm, unhurried patience. The man who had been calling me about paperwork for a month, not because he needed paperwork, but because he needed to know how alone I was. What did you tell him? Jim asked. That I needed more time to gather documents. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, the way he nodded when something landed correctly. That was the right answer. Why? He glanced in the rearview mirror before he spoke. Because it means he doesn't know yet. 4 words. He doesn't know yet. The yet sat in the car like a 5th passenger. I watched Jim's face in the mirror, steady, unreadable. The face of a fan who had Nisi Shiptama and was deciding how fast to move. And I understood for the first time that whatever was happening around me was not routine. It was not paperwork. It was not a careful seller protecting his interests. It was something I had been too tired and too grieved to see coming. I was 4 steps from my front door when my phone rang. Jim's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. I was exhausted in the specific way that settles into your bones after a double shift, the kind of tired that makes everything feel slightly unreal, like the world has a thin film over it that you can't quite see through. I answered, "Come back to the car." His voice was level, no alarm in it. That was the thing that stopped me. Not urgency, just certainty. The voice of a man who had already decided. "Jim, I have to be back at the hospital in 7 hours. The car I've been logging just made a pass on your house. No headlights, moving slow, a pause. That is not a parked car. It's the same vehicle I've logged 3 times, and this is the first time it's moved through the block after you've arrived home. Come back to the car, Ms. Freeman." I stood on my own porch for 3 seconds that felt much longer. The street was quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture to it. Not empty, just holding something back. I went back to the car. He didn't say anything when I got in. He just pulled off smoothly. No rush, no urgency in his movements. The way a man moves when he wants everything around him to look ordinary. We drove for 20 minutes before either of us spoke. "Where are we going?" I said. "Somewhere you can sleep." I looked at him through the mirror. "A motel? If you'd rather sit in the hospital waiting room until daylight, we can do that." He paused. "If you'd rather go to the police station and make report tonight, we can do that too. But I don't think you should be in that house until morning." The fact that he gave me options mattered more than I can explain. Because suddenly, I wasn't being told what to do. I was choosing. I looked out the window at the dark highway sliding past. "A motel," I said. Jim nodded once. He took us to a highway motel off I-85, nothing fancy, clean enough. He went to the front desk and paid for the room himself. Wouldn't hear anything different. And handed me the key card without making it into a moment. I want to be clear about something because I know how it sounds. I was a 53-year-old woman who had just chosen to spend the night somewhere other than her own house because of a warning from a man she had known for 6 weeks. I knew what it looked like from the outside. I had the thought and I examined it and I put it down because what I also knew was this. Jim Halbert had spent 19 years working property crime in Guilford County. He had a notebook in his glove box with 3 sightings of a specific vehicle logged against the exact times I arrived home. He had explained to me in plain language what Dale Cossett's phone calls actually meant, and he was standing in a motel parking lot at 3:30 in the morning, having paid for a room he wasn't going to use, asking for nothing except for me to be safe. Some things you know in your body before your mind catches up. I took the key card. I went inside. I locked the door. The room was quiet in the way that motel rooms are quiet, insulated from everything, sealed off from the world outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I didn't turn on the television, and I didn't call anyone, and I didn't do anything except sit there while my body finally processed what my mind had been refusing to process for weeks. The car with no headlights rolling slowly past my house. The window across the street activating every time I came home. The pleasant man calling about documentation, who wasn't calling about documentation at all. 4 years of payments. Odell's name on a contract, 3 weeks from the end. I thought about the word manageable. I thought about Jim saying he doesn't know yet, and the weight of that yet, and what it meant that there was a yet at all. I thought about sitting in that kitchen, deciding between crackers and cooking, while a man somewhere was deciding something entirely different. My hands were shaking, not because I was weak, not because I was falling apart. Because I had finally, fully, without the buffer of exhaustion or grief or the 10,000 small tasks that keep a woman from sitting still long enough to feel what is real, let myself understand what had been circling me. And it had been circling me for a long time. He knocked at 7:15. 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the road, and a small spiral notebook that he set on the table between us without preamble. "I want you to read this," he said. "All of it, don't skip anything." I sat down, I opened it. The first thing I noticed was the dates, 6 weeks of them. Every single night he had dropped me off, logged in order, date, time of arrival at Grandin Road, time my interior light activated, and directly below each entry, one additional line. Window opposite activated, X minutes post-arrival, every night, without exception. The times varied, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, once as long as 7, but the pattern did not vary. Every time I came home, something across the street woke up. I turned the page. The car. 3 entries, each with a date, a time, and a description. Dark blue 4-door sedan, older model, partial plate RT. First sighting, second sighting. Third sighting. No headlights, slow pass, directional movement consistent with confirmation of occupancy. That last entry was last night. I turned the page again, Cossette's calls. Jim had logged those too. The dates I had mentioned them during our rides, mapped on the same timeline as the surveillance entries. I stared at that page for a long time. The first call came 2 days after a cluster of window activations that were closer together than usual. The second call came 46 hours after the car's second sighting. The third call, the one asking for the death certificate and estate documentation, came the day after the car's second sighting and a window activation on the same night. The dates sat there beside each other, the watching, the calls, the car. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I set the notebook down. I picked up the coffee. My hands were steady, steadier than they had been last night, and I noticed that and filed it away. "He's been waiting," I said. "Yes," I looked back at the notebook. "The calls line up too neatly with everything else." Jim nodded. "They do." I ran my thumb along the edge of the cup. "You think the surveillance and the calls are connected." "I think they're part of the same effort," he said. "The people watching don't necessarily make the decisions. The people making the decisions don't necessarily do the watching. But the timeline suggests information was moving from one side to the other. That landed harder than if I had figured it out myself. Because Jim wasn't guessing. He was reading a pattern he had spent 19 years learning how to read. For me to either leave on my own or give him the legal opening. I said it flatly. "The way you state something, you are still in the process of believing." The documentation calls weren't pressure. They were diagnostic. He was checking whether I had an attorney, whether I understood what the contract said. Jim nodded. "A forfeiture without judicial review is fast and quiet. No court, no attorney, no one asking questions about 4 years of payments and 3 weeks remaining. He presents the contract, asserts the forfeiture clause, and the property reverts. He keeps everything paid, he resells." He paused. "But if an attorney files for equitable relief before he can assert the forfeiture, it goes in front of a judge. And no judge looks at 4 years of payments and 3 weeks remaining and calls that a clean forfeiture. He needed me gone before I found that out. You were supposed to be gone by now. The surveillance was to confirm you were isolated enough that gone was possible." I sat with that for a long moment. Isolated enough that gone was possible. I turned those words over carefully, looking at each one. I thought about what gone meant in that sentence. I thought about a man with a pleasant voice and a patient telephone manner and hired eyes on my street, watching my light come on every night, counting down to something I hadn't seen coming. I thought about Odell, 4 years, 3 weeks from the end. I looked up from the notebook. Dale Cossette. Jim said nothing. He didn't need to. The answer was already sitting between us on that table, documented in neat handwriting across 6 weeks of quiet, careful work. It had a name now. Jim didn't want me to go back. He said it once, plainly, the way he said everything, not as a command, just as information he needed me to have. I heard him. I went anyway. I needed my hospital ID, my medications, a change of clothes. I couldn't live out of a motel room indefinitely, and I wasn't going to let Dale Cossette make me afraid of own front door. Not yet. Not visibly. Jim drove me. He parked 2 houses down and he waited. I walked up to the house with my keys in my hand, and my face arranged into the specific expression I had learned to wear at the hospital when a shift was bad and the patients needed me steady, Neutral, present, giving nothing away. Dale Cossett was standing near the property line, not on the porch, not knocking, just standing. A man in a gray jacket with his hands in his pockets, patient as a man who had been there long enough to stop checking his watch. He had no reason to be in this neighborhood at 7:30 in the morning. He did not live here. He had no business on this block that I could account for. He smiled when he saw me. Freeman, warm, unhurried. I'm so glad I caught you. Did you get my last message? I did, I said. I've just been busy. Of course, of course. He nodded sympathetically. I actually drove by last night. I was in the area, and I noticed the lights were off. I got a little concerned. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right with you. He said it with the ease of a man who believed completely that what he was saying was reasonable. I noticed everything in that moment. The specific phrasing, I was in the area. The concern that wasn't concern. The information embedded inside the pleasantness. He knew I hadn't been home. He knew which lights were off and at what hour. He had driven by at 3 in the morning and checked. Or he hadn't driven by at all. And someone had told him. I smiled. Extra shift ran long, I said. I stayed with a friend. You know how it is, of course. Another nod. You work so hard. You really do. A pause, small, deliberate. And the documents. Do you think you'll have those together soon? I just want to make sure we stay current. Soon, I said. I just need a little more time to pull everything together. I appreciate your patience. He said it was no trouble at all. He said to take care of myself. He walked back to his car, a black SUV I had never seen parked on this block before, and he drove away, still pleasant, still warm, still every inch the reasonable businessman. I stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. Then I went inside, moved through the house in under 6 minutes. ID, medications, clothes, the payment book from Odell's drawer because I wanted it in my possession. And I walked back to Jim's car and got in and closed the door. We sat in silence, not the comfortable silence of our usual rides. This was a different thing. Two people on the same side of something serious, both of them processing the sheep of what had just happened. I was the one who'd been in that conversation. Jim was the one who'd watched it from 2 houses down with 19 years of training, telling him exactly what he was looking at. 2 full minutes passed. I need a lawyer, I said. Jim put the car in drive. I know one, he said. The attorney's office was on Beatty's Ford Road, a narrow suite on the 2nd floor of a building that had seen better decades but was still standing, which felt appropriate. Jim walked me up and waited in the hallway without being asked. She was mid-40s, black with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a desk covered in the organized chaos of a woman who knew exactly where everything was. She shook my hand once, firm, and gestured to the chair across from her. Tell me about the contract, she said. No preamble, no sympathy warm-up. I respected that immediately. I told her everything. The installment land contract, 4 years of payments, Odell dying 3 weeks before the final one. The deed still in Cossett's name, the documentation calls, what Jim had logged, what Cossett had said on my porch that morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she took her glasses off her head and set them on the desk and looked at me directly. He can argue the contract was voided by the buyer's death, she said. The language in most of these instruments includes a forfeiture clause. Buyer defaults or dies, the agreement terminates, the property reverts to the seller. He keeps every payment made. He gets the house back clean. I already knew this from Jim. Hearing it from her made it land differently. Heavier, more official, more real. That's what the documentation calls were about, I said. Exactly. He wasn't asking for paperwork. He was asking whether you had an attorney, whether anyone had opened the estate. Because the moment someone seeks equitable relief and opens the estate properly, that forfeiture clause goes in front of a judge. She paused. And no judge looks at 4 years of payments and 3 weeks remaining and calls that a fair forfeiture. He knows that. He does not want a judge involved. He wants the property back before anyone with legal standing has the chance to object. The fury arrived quietly. Not hot, cold. The specific cold of understanding that I had not been careless. I had been targeted by an instrument designed precisely for people in my position. People who couldn't access traditional financing, who trusted a process they didn't fully understand, who would be too overwhelmed by grief and financial pressure to ask the right questions before it was too late. There's another issue, the attorney said. You and Mr. Freeman were not legally married. No, then his legal heir is his daughter. She has standing in this estate. I can't move forward without her participation. She looked at me steadily. Is that a problem? I thought about Shira. 26 years old, grieving her father, no idea any of this existed. No, I said. It's not a problem. That night I called her. Didn't soften it too much because Shira was her father's daughter and she deserved the truth. I told her about the contract, about the forfeiture clause, about Dale Cossett standing on my porch that morning, knowing I hadn't been home the night before. I told her father had spent 4 years building something and that someone was trying to take it, and that her name on this filing was the thing that protected both of us. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Shira said, "Tell me where to sign." The next morning we sat across from the attorney together, Odell Freeman's daughter, and the woman who had loved him for 11 years, and the attorney filed the equitable relief action and opened the estate simultaneously. The forfeiture clause was now in front of a judge. Dale Cossett's window had just closed. He didn't know it yet. I had known Miss Patrice existed the way you know most things about your neighbors. Peripherally, in passing, through the evidence of her presence rather than direct conversation. 3 houses down, 70-something. On her porch most mornings with coffee and an unobstructed view of everything that moved on Grandin Road. I called her the morning after the filing. She picked up on the second ring like a woman who had been expecting someone to call eventually. I told her I was asking about Arvell. I kept it simple. I'd noticed some things. I was trying to understand the neighborhood better. I wondered if she knew him well. Miss Patrice was quiet for exactly 1 second, and then she started talking with the measured precision of a woman who had been holding information and had decided the time for holding it was over. Arvell Delco had lived across from me for 11 years. He had been on that block before the contractors started showing up, before the property values started climbing, before the neighborhood began its slow erasure of itself. He had watched every black family sell or get pressured out one by one. He had stayed. Miss Patrice said that used to mean something about a man. About 4 months ago, right around the time I moved in, someone had approached him. She didn't know who. Arvell hadn't given her a name. He hadn't told her much at all. Just enough for her to understand that somebody wanted information about the woman across the street. Miss Patrice said she never asked questions because neighbors survive a long time by minding certain boundaries. But she knew something was sitting on him because Arvell Delco had been her neighbor for over a decade, and she knew what he looked like when he was carrying weight he hadn't planned to carry. Lately, he'd been jumpy, wouldn't hold eye contact at the mailbox, stopped sitting on his porch in the evenings the way he used to, started checking the street before stepping outside. The changes were small, but they were there. I don't know what he agreed to, Miss Patrice said, and I don't know who approached him. But whatever it was, he wishes he hadn't done it. I listened to all of it without saying much. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of the kitchen and felt the specific grief of it. Not rage, not yet, just grief. Arvell Delco was not a stranger. He was a man who had watched me come home exhausted every single night for months. He had seen me in my uniform. He had probably seen me stand on my own porch holding a cup of coffee with no one to give it to. And somewhere along the way, he had become part of whatever was happening around me. I thought about what Jim had said once, that the surveillance was to confirm I was isolated enough that gone was possible. And I thought about the fact that the man confirming my isolation lived 3 doors down and had been on that block longer than I had. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was architectural. Someone had looked at this neighborhood and found exactly the right crack to put pressure on. That evening, Jim drove me past the house slowly. Arvell's window was dark. It had been dark the previous night, too. The filing was public record. Anyone who knew to look could find it. Cossett would have found it within 24 hours. And Arvell, sitting in that dark house, would know that whatever he had agreed to had become something else entirely. Something bigger. Something that now had attorneys involved. Something that had a judge's name on it now. For nearly 2 weeks after the filing, nothing happened. No calls, no surprise visits. No cars creeping past the house, no messages, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder whether the danger has passed or simply changed shape. Miss Patrice called me at 2:17 in the morning. I was in Jim's car. We had driven around after my shift the way we had been doing since the motel. not going directly to the house, taking the long way, staying mobile until we were both satisfied the block was clear. It had become our routine inside the new routine. Survival has its own rhythms. Her voice was steady. That was the first thing I noticed. 70-something years old, 2 in the morning, and Miss Patrice sounded like a woman who had been ready for exactly this. "There's a man at your side door," she said. "He's been there 4 minutes. I already called 911. I didn't speak for a moment. "He's trying the lock," she said. "Now something just broke, the frame around the side window. He put something against it." A pause. "He's looking around. He doesn't know I'm watching." Jim had already pulled over. He was looking at me with that still, focused expression that meant he was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. I told Miss Patrice to stay inside, stay away from the windows, stay on with 911 until the officers arrived. She said she knew what to do. She had been knowing what to do since before I was born, and she hung up. I sat in the passenger seat of that gray sedan and felt something move through me that wasn't fear. Fear had been 2 weeks ago, in a motel room with shaking hands. This was different. This was the cold, settled fury of a woman who has been patient and careful and strategic, and has just watched someone walk up to what is hers and put a tool against the window frame. "He sent someone," I said, because the filing spooked him. Jim was already pulling back onto the road. "The forfeiture route is closed." He needed another way to make the property available. I understood what he meant. A vacant property, unoccupied, owner deceased or disappeared, was easier to move against than one with an active legal filing and a living claimant. Gone needed to mean actually gone. By the time we reached Grandin Road, 2 patrol cars were already there. Blue lights cutting through the dark. A third car pulling up as we parked. The man at my side door had not stayed to meet them. He was gone, but what he left behind was not nothing. A damaged window latch, a splintered door frame edge. Physical evidence that something deliberate had been done to my property by someone who had no right to be there. Miss Patrice was on her porch in a housecoat and slippers, talking to an officer with the calm authority of a woman giving sworn testimony. She had seen him clearly. She had noted the car. Jim got out and I followed him. He spoke to the officers for several minutes while I stood to the side and watched. He used a specific tone I had not heard from him before, not the quiet, deliberate voice of our car conversations, but the measured, precise register of a man who had spent 19 years on the other side of these conversations and knew exactly how they worked. He opened his glove box. He took out his notebook. He handed it to the officer directly. Not offered, handed, with the particular authority of a man who knew the weight of documented evidence and how to transfer it correctly. "This is 6 weeks of logged surveillance on this property," Jim said. "Dates, times, vehicle descriptions, behavioral patterns. The car your witness just described matches 3 prior logged sightings." The officer looked at the notebook. Then he looked at Jim. Then he looked at me. For the first time since Dale Cossett's name entered my life, a person with a badge was looking at the full shape of what had been happening and could not file it away as a neighbor dispute or a civil matter. This had a paper trail. This had a witness. This had a broken door frame and a name at the end of a 6-week log. This was now something else entirely. The detective called me 5 weeks after the break-in. By then, enough time had passed for impatience to become its own kind of exhaustion. The officers had come and gone. Statements had been taken. The damaged window frame had been photographed. Life had resumed its strange balance between ordinary routine and the knowledge that something serious was moving beneath the surface. The detective was methodical and unhurried in the way investigators are when they have already found the first thread and are simply pulling it. He told me Jim's logged vehicle description had become part of a larger review. The partial plate, vehicle make, and witness statements had been compared against records from prior civil disputes involving installment land contracts in Mecklenburg and Guilford counties. Phone records, vehicle registrations, and property filings had all been examined before any conclusions were drawn. The vehicle descriptions connected investigators to a man who had appeared as a witness in a civil filing against one of Cossett's other properties 3 years earlier. A dispute that had been settled quietly. The kind of quiet that costs money and comes with signatures that say nothing happened. That name was now in front of law enforcement. I asked what happened next. The detective said they were following the chain. I had learned enough in the past several weeks to understand what that meant. Each connection documented, each link verified before the next one was touched. Jim had handed them a 6-week foundation. They had spent more than a month building on top of it. What I didn't know yet was what had been happening on Arvel Delco's side of the street. Jim told me later. He had heard it from the detective during one of their follow-up conversations. Two spoke the same professional language, finding it efficient to communicate directly. A detective had knocked on Arvel's door about a week after the break-in. Arvel had answered in the specific way of a man who had been rehearsing for this moment, cooperative on the surface, closed underneath. He didn't know anything. He was just a neighbor. He minded his own business. The detective didn't push. He left a card. He said if anything came to mind, Arvel should call. Several days later, Cossette's associate contacted Arvel. Keep your mouth shut. That was the message. Delivered plainly, without warmth, by a man whose voice Arvel recognized as the same man who had handed him $800 and told him this was simple. Jim said the detective later told him that call changed everything because Arvel Delco, who had taken money to watch a neighbor and told himself it wasn't a big deal, could absorb a lot of moral weight. He had been absorbing it for months, the jumpy silences, the dark window, the avoiding of eye contact at the mailbox. What he could not absorb was the understanding that he was no longer a peripheral figure in something manageable. He was now a witness being told to stay quiet. That was a different category entirely. That had a different set of consequences attached to it. Arvel called the detective the following morning. He told them about the approach, the $800, the instructions, note her schedule, note her routine, report any changes. He told them about the car and the man who drove it. He gave them the associate's name. Investigators spent the next several weeks verifying everything he said. Phone records, vehicle registrations, financial records, and prior property files were reviewed and compared against Arvel's account. By the time they finished, his statement was no longer standing alone. It was supported by evidence moving in the same direction. The chain that Jim had started building 6 weeks ago in a spiral notebook in his glove box now had every link connected. When the detective called me to tell me what was coming, I was in my hospital uniform, standing in the break room, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. The hired man was arrested first. The associate followed, after investigators completed their interviews and records review. Dale Cossette was brought in for questioning shortly afterward. Not at his office, not with a polite phone call, but at 7:15 in the morning, with 2 detectives at his front door, and nowhere pleasant to root the conversation. I didn't celebrate. I sat down in the break room chair and I breathed, not relief exactly. Something more structural than that. The specific feeling of a foundation holding under weight it was designed to hold. Jim's log, the attorney's filing, Shira's name on the paperwork, Miss Patrice on her porch at 2 in the morning. Arvel's conscience arriving late but arriving. Every link, every one. The court ruling came on a Thursday morning. The attorney called me while I was getting ready for my shift. She didn't lead with pleasantries. She said the judge had reviewed the equitable relief filing and ruled the forfeiture clause unconscionable. 4 years of payments, substantial performance, 3 weeks from completion. The judge had looked at the full picture of that contract and concluded that enforcing the forfeiture would be inequitable under the circumstances. 4 years of equity could not simply vanish because a buyer died weeks before the finish line. The property interest converted to a recordable deed. She said it again, slower, because I had gone quiet. The deed was now recordable. Wiling Freeman and Shira Freeman, both names, on the title. The house that Odell had spent 4 years paying for, that someone had spent months trying to take, was legally, documentably, permanently ours. I sat down on the edge of the bed in my uniform and I let that land. The civil action came several weeks later. The attorney had filed against Dale Cossette for intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil trespass, harassment, and related claims arising from the documented conduct surrounding the property dispute. She walked me through the basis for each claim with the same plain-spoken precision she had used from the first day. No inflation, no promises, just the documented record laid against the applicable law. 6 weeks of logged surveillance, the intimidation call to Arvel, the attempted break-in with a witness and physical evidence. The contract structure that had nearly stripped away 4 years of equity at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The case did not end all at once. Some claims were resolved through settlement discussions. Others continued forward. When everything was finished, settlements, court orders, and attorney fee awards combined, the total recovery came to $114,000. $42,000 represented direct damages and losses. The remainder reflected punitive findings and related recoveries attached to the broader conduct. The attorney's fees were addressed through the final resolution. I paid nothing out of pocket. I want you to understand what that number meant. Not as wealth. I had not suddenly become a wealthy woman. But Dale Cossett had structured his entire operation around the certainty that a grieving, isolated, unrepresented woman would cost him nothing. That she would either disappear under pressure or be removed. That whatever she had built would fold quietly into his balance sheet without resistance. $114,000 was the legal system's answer to that certainty. He had calculated my powerlessness as an asset. The courts calculated it as a liability and handed me the difference. I called Shira that evening. We talked for almost an hour, longer than we had talked since her father's funeral. She cried a little. I let her. She said she kept thinking about Odell, about how close he had been, about the fact that his name was in a court record, now confirming that what he had built was real and valid and worth fighting for. I told her it was going to stay real. That was the thing about a recorded deed. Nobody could quietly make it disappear. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen, Odell's kitchen, my kitchen, our kitchen, and I thought about what came next. I had won. That was not a small thing, and I did not treat it as one. But winning did not mean staying. Staying meant waking up every morning on a block where a man had paid $800 to watch my light come on, where a car had rolled past my house without headlights confirming I was home, where the neighborhood had been slowly engineered to make people like me feel like guests in their own lives. I didn't want to be a guest anymore. I wanted to choose. I picked up my phone and called a real estate agent. Full market value, my timeline, my terms. Not because I had lost anything, because I had won everything, and now the next move was mine. The house sold in 11 days at ask. To a young couple. She was a teacher. He worked in logistics. They had a baby on the way, and kept asking about the school district with the specific hopefulness of people building something from scratch. I let myself feel good about that. Odell had spent 4 years paying for something worth passing forward. It was going forward. Shira and I split the proceeds cleanly, the way the attorney had structured it. Her half, my half, no friction, no grief between us as about the numbers. It was the most money I had ever had at one time in my life. I did not do anything dramatic with it. I paid off what needed paying. I put the rest away carefully, the way my mother taught me to treat anything you work too hard to lose. Then I signed a lease on an apartment on the east side of Greensboro. My name, my decision. My peace. I want to tell you what it felt like to write my name on that lease. Not as a woman continuing someone else's paperwork, not as a grieving partner trying to hold a half-finished thing together, but as Wyaline Freeman, sole tenant, choosing where she lived because she wanted to live there. It felt like standing up straight after months of bracing for impact. The first night in the apartment, I sat by the window with coffee, and I let myself think about Odell without the weight of the crisis around it. Not the Tuesday morning, not the payment book, not the paperwork in the drawer, just him. The 11 years. The man who believed that owning something outright was the only kind of owning that meant anything. Who had found a house in a neighborhood he loved and paid for it faithfully for 4 years because that was the kind of man he was. Someone had tried to erase that. They had built a scheme around the certainty that his death would unravel what he had built, that the grief and the paperwork and the isolation would be enough to make his 4 years of work disappear quietly into another man's balance sheet. It didn't disappear. His name was in a court record now. His 4 years of payments were documented in a judge's ruling that called the instrument, designed to steal them exactly what it was. Nobody erased Odell Freeman. They tried. They failed. That mattered to me in a way I didn't have words big enough to hold. I thought about what saved me. Not a dramatic rescue. No sirens, no confrontation, no moment where someone swept in and fixed everything. What saved me was a cup of coffee. Set out every night at the end of a hospital shift for a man I didn't have to think about. A small, automatic act of taking care that my hands did because they had forgotten how to stop. And a man who took that cup every night and paid attention in return. Not because he was looking for something to fix. Because 19 years of watching neighborhoods had made him unable to unknow what he knew. Because when something looked wrong, he wrote it down. Because when the car came past without headlights, he called me before I reached my own door. I don't have a word for what Jim Halbert is to me. Friend doesn't cover it. Something rarer than that. Something that only exists when one person's ordinary decency meets another person's ordinary decency at exactly the right moment, and together they become something neither of them could have been alone. The last morning I left Grandin Road, Jim drove me. I had 2 cups, one for me, one for him. Same as always. He took it the same way he always had, without making a production of it, without needing it to mean more than it meant. We drove in silence down streets I was seeing for the last time. Somewhere on the highway I started crying, not loudly. Just quietly, the way you cry when something is finally over and the body needs to mark it. Jim didn't ask why. He already knew. He always had.